with the power of association. Another example, in May of 2005, there's a cricket player by the name of Imran Khan, a Pakistani. Newsweek, that's the Washington Post magazine founded by Eugene Meyer, bought it out of bankruptcy in '33. Newsweek published an article by a fellow named David Ishakoff, who claimed that U.S. troops and interrogators flushed a Koran down the toilet. That's considered sacrilege in Islam. Now, Newsweek retracted that story 10 days later, saying it was insufficiently documented. So what happened was Imran Khan somehow was induced to step out and announce that the United States had desecrated a Koran. Now, when Imran Khan says it, it'd be like a Hank Aaron or a baseball or a football star saying it in the United States. You took the field-based quality of Imran Khan, his celebrity, and you use that as a weapon in the same way you use the credibility of Colin Powell. By deploying Imran Khan's celebrity, you breached the literacy barrier. When he said it, that story went viral in Muslim nations worldwide. It reached tens of millions of people because a celebrity said it. So when you're waging field-based warfare, this is where this is being waged. It's not in a tangible battlefield. It's in the field, the shared field of consciousness. So that's where you deploy intangible properties in that field. Credibility, celebrity, those types of things. And that's how you wage warfare. In plain sight, you can't really quite see it. And that's how this works. Who in this operation, and it is an operation, has the skill set with which to embed, to really shape a consensus, a shared state of mind, a shared mindset in such a fashion that we would, believe in something that's not true. When trying to grasp the scope of this sort of what I call belief-based criminality, the sort of a faith-based organized crime, I have faith that if we simply let financial markets work their will worldwide, then everything will be fine. We'll have orchids blooming in the sewers. I've advised in 35 countries, usually the finance minister, the prime minister, in the unwinding of public ownership to private ownership, what we used to think of as Marx to sort of, Milton Friedman or Adam Smith, that sort of thing. And what we found is uniformly what happened as we came out of state ownership, we ended up creating these oligarchies. Everywhere you look, the Russian oligarchs being an obvious case in point. And when Russia came out of that highly dysfunctional sort of system, suddenly you look back, and as I worked there with Gorbachev's first economic team, brief Yeltsin within a few weeks of him being sworn in, I sensed somehow the fix was in, but it was not until I took on this particular task that I realized on whose behalf and how. And that's what we're trying to get people to see. But for example, in the unwinding of Marx in the former Soviet Union, by the time the oligarchs came into their own, 6 of the top 7 oligarchs qualified for Israeli citizenship. In a country like the United States that's less than 2% Jewish, how can you have 84% of these oligarchs having that similar, ethnic background? So, what really was going on here? If you look back into part of my personal history was being there for what we call supply side economics, brought to us by Ronald Reagan. I was finance committee counsel from '80 to 1987, so I saw that up close and personal. And what it was guaranteed to do financially, and there's a chapter about that in the book, it was guaranteed to make the rich far, far richer. And now if you look back and look at the dominant ethnicity of the Forbes 400, it's very similar to what we have in Russia. So you go back through this and you begin to say, well, how did we adopt a mindset where we thought that money really should be the compass by which we guide the nation? How did that happen? How did that get embedded in education? How did I myself embrace that? I'm the son of a Chicago-educated PhD in economics, trained in economics, trained in law. By the time I show up as finance committee counsel, I've got this sort of consensus frame through which I view my world. How did that happen? And that's what the book is about. It's about trying to give people a broader perspective to see that they themselves are part of the problem, because we've all been educated into this same frame through which we see our world. And unfortunately, the United States is we're now branded with that. We now look like we are part of the problem, which we are, because we've taken that frame and we've insisted that people draft the laws in their own countries to embrace that money myopic, finance-fixated frame in which you're guaranteed to create oligarchies, you're guaranteed to undermine democracies, you're guaranteed to impair genuine markets. That's how organized crime operates at scale, like that. You know, where did this come from? How did we get to this point? Well, if you go back, there's a book that was published in 1996 called The Clash of Civilizations by a Harvard professor named Samuel Huntington. But like most things, there's a history to this. In the case of The Clash did not begin with Samuel Huntington. He published an article in Foreign Affairs in 1993 that became the book in 1996. But before that, Bernard Lewis, who was a Zionist, interesting fellow, branded himself as an Islamic scholar. He is one that really gave that theme to Samuel Huntington. By the time it migrated through Foreign Affairs and then into a best-selling book by Huntington, how did it become a best-selling book, and how did this clash of civilizations become a consensus, a widely held belief, right? Well, it happened because by the time Huntington released that book, there were over 100 non-governmental organizations, the Heritage Foundation, the American Enterprise Institute. Just go down the list of, people with enormous amount of budget, enormous amount of media exposure, who said this is the new consensus, the clash of civilizations. And you might have noticed how seamlessly we segued from the Cold War to the clash of civilizations. Some of you will remember the peace dividend. What happened to the peace dividend? The Cold War is over, and suddenly we're in a clash of civilizations. Where did this come from? Did we just suddenly start hating Muslims? Did Muslims just suddenly start hating Americans? I mean, where did this come from? So you have a period of preparing the mind, launching the clash of civilizations in 1996. 2001, you get the emotionally wrenching attack on the United States, and emotion plays a big role in this because emotion is a well-known way to displace facts. Because when people are emotionally aroused, emotionally upset, particularly when they're angry, they're more willing to respond viscerally. And if you have a pre-staged evildoer like a Saddam Hussein, who everyone knows is an evildoer, then suddenly it becomes plausible that he is where we need to go take out Saddam Hussein, who was an evildoer, had something to do with 9/11. We now know that was a total fiction, but it doesn't matter. Now we're at war in the Middle East. Who would have the means, the motivation, the opportunity, and importantly, who would have the stable nation-state intelligence to embed that kind of operation inside that country? That is who the criminal syndicate is. People ask, how did this criminal syndicate gain so much control, for example, over the U.S. Congress, over the office of the presidency? And it's really a matter of mathematics. If you understand, if the book really has a summary on that right in the introduction. How did McCain-Feingold, as it was called a campaign finance reform. It was anything but that. In effect, what it did was raise the limits that individuals can give to campaigns. And if you understand how campaign finance really works, let me give you an example. McCain-Feingold increased the dollar amount that individuals could give from $1,000 to $2,300 per person per election, both the primary and the general election. So if you're a couple, you can give $2,300 in the primary, another $2,300, individual $2,300 in the primary, $2,300 in the general. If you're a couple, that's $4,600. So effect, an individual family, a husband, wife, can give $9,200 to a candidate. Now, if you take the way Washington really works, is you have what's called bundlers. For example, if I pass the beauty contest, as it's called, for the Israel lobby, they will call a bundler on my behalf, and they'll say, this person has passed the beauty contest, go out and raise money for them. So the bundler will himself contribute, and his wife, or other way around. They will then call 10 other bundlers. If you do the math, you end up with each of those is 11 times $9,200. So you end up with over $1 million with literally just one phone call. From, again, the Israel lobby gives you the phone number of the contact for this one person, and suddenly you've got $1 million to run a campaign. And some of the smaller districts, congressional districts, that's enough to run a credible campaign, or at least certainly enough to get a campaign kick-started. So that's how the Israel lobby embedded themselves into congressional campaigns. They then focused on not only grooming candidates, but also making sure that once they're in the Congress, that they groom them for seniority, and then also opposing people who would oppose the Israel agenda being the primary agenda of the U.S. And so if you combine all those things, you get an enormous force multiplier. If you understand that although there's over 450 members of Congress, 452, only about 10% of those are competitive in any given year, 30 to maybe 50. So if you then concentrate your money on the competitive races, it's another force multiplier. So people ask, how could those who are so few have such influence? Well, it's a matter of numbers. You concentrate your resources on competitive races. You make sure that people who are looking to run for office, you make sure you give them a lot of money early on. You get them embedded in the system. You get them embedded to your agenda. And if you do that for long enough, and this crowd has been doing this for several decades now, you have an enormous amount of influence in the Congress. And you do the same thing on the presidential side, and that, again, is detailed in the books. And suddenly the force multiplying effect is quite extraordinary. George W. Bush, again, a classic asset, as was John McCain, an absolute classic asset. But George Bush came out of, he was a brand name politician. If you watched politics very closely in 2000, the syndicate that is being chronicled and profiled in these accounts, in the span of about 6 weeks, raised about $50 million for this brand name politician, George W. Bush, a former governor. $50 million. In effect, the Republican primary was preempted. By the time the nominating convention came along, it was a fait accompli. This was going to be the nominee. Once you do that, you begin to fill in well, in Washington we used to call it the plum book. It literally was a plum. I think it's a different color now. But it's the 3,000 to 6,000 positions that are filled in by the lead of the executive branch, the undersecretary, the deputy assistant secretary, all these positions that are filled in. So once you got the nominee and you got the election well underway, you begin to look in that book and you put your people in the small, narrow part of the funnel for information going into the White House for decision making. For example, you don't need to be the head of the CIA. You can set up your own intelligence operation called the Office of Special Plans in the Pentagon, run by a fellow named Douglas Feith, and you can cook your own intelligence, send it in through the Deputy Defense Secretary, Paul Wolfowitz, in through the Vice President's office, where a fellow named Scooter Libby would take it directly into the decision-making process. That's only 3 people, okay? So that's how you begin to take game theory, how you begin to take this and put it on the ground. So you can begin to manipulate the intelligence. Well, it's difficult, and indeed, I don't go to motivation of those who've done this. I go to the how that it was done. I'll let the readers and the viewers in this case make up their own mind about why someone would do this. But what we do know is that we have an enclave of extremists in the Middle East that we embraced as an ally, and indeed we extended nation-state recognition to them in 1948, which we're finding now was a key strategic mistake. And it was particularly a mistake for moderate and secular Jews who embraced this notion, who rejected the notion in 1948, but now tend to embrace it because they've been led to believe if this enclave is somehow threatened, that they themselves are threatened, which is not all the case, but they've been led to believe that.